Hello there, you're watching on television. This is State of Business. I am Pramutha Kattukampala. Our top stories. Global West moves to support the nation. Tourism sector hopes to achieve target earnings. Welcome back, you're watching State of Business. Now let's have a detailed look at today's stories. UK Minister of State for the Middle East, North Africa, South Asia and the UN, Lord Tariq Ahmed says human rights must be part of the conversation on helping Sri Lanka. The Minister expressed his position while responding to Lord Moylan during a recent House of Lords session.
My Lords, the UK Government stands alongside our partners and have worked in the Human Rights Council core group on Sri Lanka, which has led to international efforts over many years to promote accountability, reconciliation, human rights in Sri Lanka, including most recently implementing the UN Human Rights Council Resolution 51-1. The resolution renewed the mandate of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to report on Sri Lanka and to protect and preserve evidence of past human rights abuses to use in future accountability processes.
My Lords, going beyond my noble friend's answer, and given that next year is the 75th anniversary of Sri Lanka's independence, and therefore its long partnership with Great Britain as a member of the Commonwealth, would my noble friend be able to say if Her Majesty's government will consider working with Sri Lanka to invest in a large landmark development scheme for the country that would help add resilience in the future against the economic shocks of the sort that we've seen it suffer recently?
My Lords, I assure my noble friend, notwithstanding the continuing prioritisation we're giving to human rights, and that has to remain part of that conversation and discussion to ensure that the issues that arose from the previous civil war, particularly, and the targeting of particular communities is not forgotten, and that's why we remain resolute in what we're doing at the HRC. But I take on board the specific element of economic empowerment of communities as a way to build a country, and certainly in previous months, earlier this year, as the then Minister responsible for our relations with Sri Lanka, I've met with President Wickremesinghe. I've recently again also met with Foreign Minister Ali Sabri, and our focus has also been on the current IMF package and how that should act as a lever to ensure economic prosperity for all communities across Sri Lanka.
Meanwhile, the United States yesterday handed over 9,300 metric tons of urea fertilizer to the Ministry of Agriculture to distribute to more than 193,000 smallholder paddy farmers. This agriculture aid covers farmers in Jaffna, Mullaitivu, Mana, Vaunia, Anuradhapura, Trincomalee, Batticaloa and Monragala districts. The fertilizer procured by FAO with funding from the US Agency for International Development is the first shipment of USAID-supported fertilizer assistance. Additional supplies are anticipated in the coming months that will reach close to 1 million farmers across the country. US Ambassador to Sri Lanka, Juliet Chang, speaking at a handover event held at the Colombo port, held that this fertilizer will help Sri Lankan farmers to keep countless families fed in the months ahead. The United States, through USAID, has approved $46 million in funding to procure essential fertilizer to increase paddy production and avert a food crisis, a portion of which arrived recently. This funding will also provide cash assistance to smallholder farmers who have suffered due to low yields over the last two agricultural seasons and on account of the prevailing economic crisis. USAID and its partners have mechanisms in place to monitor and evaluate their work, ensuring that assistance reaches its intended recipients and benefits vulnerable farming households. Anjali Kaur, USAID's Deputy Assistant Administrator of the Asia Bureau, expressed that the organization is delivering on a commitment to reach smallholder paddy farmers with fertilizer during the planting season to secure yield and harvests. Now, it's been reported that Paris Club creditor nations are proposing a 10-year moratorium on Sri Lankan debt and another 15 years of debt restructuring. It presents this as a formula to resolve the financial crisis. While the Paris Club is still to formally reach out to India and China, two of Sri Lanka's biggest creditors, with Beijing holding near 50% of external debt, Colombo on its part is still to initiate a formal dialogue with China. Meanwhile, the chances of getting extended fund facility of $2.9 billion approved by the IMF Executive Board this month range from very low to non-existent. This means that Sri Lanka will have to wait for the March IMF meeting before any aid is extended by the Bretton Woods institution. While Sri Lanka owes some $800 million in structured debt to India, the Indian government has approved emergency aid close to $4 billion to the island nation to tide over its economic crisis. China, Chinese Exim Bank, and China Development Bank holds billions of US debt with Sri Lanka's total external debt touching nearly $40 billion. The Sri Lankan government's public debt has gone up from 115.3% of GDP by the end of 2021 to 143.7% of the GDP by the end of June 2022. For Sri Lanka to revive, creditors will have to take a huge haircut with Paris Club, clearly hinting that the Global South should also take the same cut as the Global North, notwithstanding the inequitable distribution of wealth. In the meantime, Sri Lanka will need bridging funding to endure the next 3 months before the IMF Executive Board meeting in March 2023. See you soon with more stories after this short commercial break.
IWS Aviation.
Welcome back. You're watching State of Business. Now, the tourism industry has witnessed a good start to the winter season, with November arrivals topping over 59,000 mark, recording the highest since April. Sri Lanka welcomed 59,759 tourists in November, up to 42.2% from 42,026 in October, and surpassing the 620,000 travellers in the first 11 months. The boost in arrivals was largely influenced by the influx of Russian tourists and the resumption of many new international airlines and charter flights to Colombo. Arrivals in the first 11 months amounted to 568,258, a welcome development for the triple-hit tourism industry, but performance is still down by 69.4% compared to the same period in pre-COVID 2018. In November, Russia topped the tourist traffic to Sri Lanka with 13,820 tourists, reflecting 23% of the total arrivals. In addition, tourists will also arrive from the US, Canada, France, Maldives and Switzerland, Sri Lankan Tourism Development Authority data showed. India also stood strong as the top tourist source market for Sri Lanka year to date, with the cumulative number of arrivals at 105,654. Sri Lanka has been included among the 20 best countries in the world as per the 2022 Reader's Choice Awards conducted by the popular and influential magazine Condé Nast Traveller. Despite the slow progress, the industry stakeholders are hopeful that the sector can achieve a target of around 750,000 tourists while generating $1.75 billion by the end of the year. As per central bank data, tourism sector earnings crossed the $1 billion mark in October. This follows October earnings amounting to $75.6 million, up from $53.6 million in September this year. Meanwhile, state revenues received a boost from the recently introduced tax hikes and inflation that climbed to 70%, helping the government control the unrestrained budget deficit. Treasury data up to July shows that total government revenue including grants climbed 36.7% from a year ago to 1,093.3 billion rupees. Tax revenues generated 1,092.2 billion rupees compared to 798.9 billion in the same period last year, as the tax collections had a sizable impact from the surge in inflation. This boosted the cash flows of companies, while the higher taxes started kicking in from June onwards. Meanwhile, expenses rose 15.9% to 2,103.4 billion rupees in the 7 months from a year ago, with the recurrent expenditure rising 1,827.5 billion rupees. Capital expenditure minus repayment rose 16.7% to 275.8 billion rupees. After the economy collapsed, the government raised tax rates while keeping a close tab on expenditure. This was a bid to contain the budget deficit, which had been a main source of inflation and thereby causing instability in Sri Lankan economy. With the first round of revenue reforms and other factors, the government reported a budget deficit of 1,010.1 billion rupees in the first 7 months. Meanwhile, the domestic financing of the budget deficit fell to 1,053.4 billion rupees and foreign financing recorded a net repayment of 43.3 billion rupees. Outstanding government debt increased to 24.7 trillion rupees by end June as sharp rupee depreciation since March caused the rupee value of foreign currency debt to inflate. Outstanding credit card balance has dipped in October, a dual sign that banks may be tightening their credit card standards while consumers are also pulling back on their spending. The data for the month showed that the outstanding credit card balance had slipped by 64 million rupees in October to 136.7 billion rupees after slowing down in September. Consumer prices spiked to 70% when the economic crisis fried runaway inflation since April this year. Thus, the trajectory of the credit card balance is counterintuitive, where consumers tend to take on more credit card debt to finance their purchases when their incomes become insufficient to meet their monthly household expenses. With the October data on card balances, the total outstanding card balance of the licensed commercial banking sector stood at 136.7 billion rupees, an increase of just 3.4 billion rupees in 10 months. The card balance also reflects how tight the credit conditions have become in a matter of months after the central bank turned extremely aggressive, tightening the monetary policy, promoting banks to raise their interest rates up to 36% on cards. Some banks also started slashing the card limits, citing the worsening macroeconomic conditions to limit card spend in a bid to contain a possible fallout from potential defaults. Despite the dent in the outstanding card balance and the tight credit conditions, banks managed to issue 3,496 million new cards in October. Stay tuned for this stock update. Welcome back, you're watching State of Business, and now the stock update. Trading at Colombo Stock Exchange ended on positive notes today. The all-share price index gained 72.66 points to close at 8,916.41, and the S&P SL 20 gained 43.62 points to close at 2,853.12. The turnover was 3.1 billion rupees, and over 149 million shares were traded. Coming up next are Forex rates. Well, that's a wrap from today's edition of State of Business. For this and more, subscribe to our channel on YouTube and follow us on Facebook. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.